good?
Yes.
All right. Why don't we go ahead and start then? There's a prayer by St. Maximus the Confessor from the 7th century, 6th century. Reading Scripture. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Come, O all hymned Word of God, and give us, in the degree fitting to us, the revelation of your own words. Remove the thickness of the veils that cover them, and show us, O Christ, the beauty of their inner meaning. Take us by our right hand, that is, the power of understanding within us, and guiding us in the way of your commandments, lead us to the place of your wondrous tabernacle, unto the very house of God, with a voice of rejoicing and confession, so that through confession manifested in practice, and through joy realized in contemplation, we too may be counted worthy to come to the ineffable place of your feasting, and join our voices of praise to those who spiritually keep festival, singing with the silent voices of the mind the praises of the knowledge of your unutterable mysteries. And forgive me, O Christ, and have mercy on me, for I now recklessly dare to attempt things beyond my power. Therefore illumine my darkened mind for the contemplation of the words now before me, so that you may be glorified even more, for giving light to eyes that were blind, and articulate speech to a tongue that was mute. For the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. So, welcome back, everyone. We have had now 2 sessions where is it recording? Are we good? Okay, thank you. So we've had 2 sessions so far where initially, remember I said that we would be giving a little bit of organization to our scriptural understanding. And that where we would start is with 3 main themes, 3 main locations, and 6 people. The 3 themes being redemption, covenant, and theosis. The 3 locations are what we're going to primarily talk tonight. And then we would also talk about 6 main people: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus. Now, I should put a little asterisk, by the way, for Jesus, because unlike the others, what you find is him actually from Genesis through Revelation. Christ is in fact the interpretive key to the scriptures, which we'll talk about as we go on. But we've talked about redemption, the notion of first the cultural context, which is this patriarchal, patrilocal, and patrilineal society, which was the father's household being the basis of all Near Eastern society, and how that helps us to understand this notion of redemption. Before we move into the concept of covenant and begin to analyze and examine the covenants that are contained within the scriptures, we have to have a little bit more of a framework of the overall view of the Old Testament, just so that we know where to place these covenants that are going to occur, because we're going to see God's covenant with mankind develop and grow over time until the time of the new covenant with Christ. And so today, we're going to try and give a little bit of that structure. So we're going to be talking about time and space over the course of today. I mentioned that, and let me step back and be really clear. I'm going to run through, as we go through today, more facts, more history than I will be going through in any other talk, and I don't expect you to actually remember it all. Okay, that's not really the point. What I want you to pay attention to as we go through what we're talking about today is first the 3 locations, right? Mesopotamia, we're going to talk, Egypt, and Canaan, which becomes known as Palestine or Israel, okay? These are the 3 places we're going to talk about. And then we're going to show how the 5 main Old Testament figures, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, fit in with these locations and the overall timeline of the Old Testament. You don't need to remember all of it. If you can remember the 3 locations and the 5 people that we're going to mainly talk about today, And as I talk about the timeline, pay attention to those places and people, okay? If you don't remember the other stuff, don't worry about it. We're going to go through all of this in a little bit more detail as we go along, okay? But the three main places, Mesopotamia, right? Egypt, Canaan, Israel, Palestine. Those are the three places that we want to remember, because that's where basically the entirety of the Bible takes place. A couple of little exceptions, primarily when we get into the New Testament with Paul's journeys, and he starts going beyond into North Africa and Europe. But really, almost the entirety of the Bible takes place in these three places. So, I know it's been a while since we studied ancient history, probably somewhere in about 6th grade. Geography, maybe in 8th grade. So let's start way zoomed out, okay? Let's start way zoomed out. This, if you're not aware, is where we live. This is the world. All right? And we're going to be focusing in on a very small little area. Well, maybe it doesn't show up very well here. One small little section of the world right in here where my beam is, you can see it. Just this little area right here, okay? And this is called, now look, back up. Can you already start to get a sense for why that particular little area, which came to be known as the Fertile Crescent, right? Why that might be so important of an area? If you see, it's right at the crossroads, pretty much, of Europe, Africa, and Asia, all right there in the center, right? The entirety of the old world essentially passes through that region. And there are trade routes that existed in the ancient world that still exist to this day that go right through that whole section. It's at a major crossroads. Okay? Now, it wasn't quite the crossroads initially, because people were still very spread out. But as time goes on, this becomes an incredibly important crossroads for the entire old world. So, like I said, zooming in a little bit more, this becomes known as the Fertile Crescent area. You see over here is Egypt with the Nile River. You have Canaan right through here, which later is known as Israel or Palestine. And then Mesopotamia, all through here. And why was it called the Fertile Crescent? Let me start. The ground was fertile. And it's in the shape of a crescent. Real simple. Now, it might be a little surprising to think of this as being a fertile area, right? Because we think of it and it's arid, it's dry, it's essentially desert. Well, what you see is throughout this whole area, there are a whole lot of important rivers. So, for example, you have here the Euphrates, right? You have the Tigris River here. You have the Jordan River, you have the Nile River and its delta, and a number of other important rivers, especially down in the area you see where it says Babylonia, Elam, and Sumer. Those are essentially the floodplains of Persian Gulf and the Tigris and Euphrates. So there's a whole lot of water there, all of which can be irrigated, right? It can be used for irrigation, and they can grow. In fact, anthropologists and archaeologists will tell us that it is in this area of Mesopotamia where we see within human history the first intentional agriculture, okay, so real farming, and the first cities. In order to have a city, you have to have agriculture to support it, right? If you're doing anything other than subsistence farming, you're going to need something much bigger, right? And so it's here in this area of Mesopotamia. Now, for any Greek speakers in the room, what does Mesopotamia mean? In the middle of the rivers, right? What are the two rivers? Euphrates and Tigris, right? Those two main rivers, and in between them is Mesopotamia, essentially. It's currently today, you can see it's just a little bit of east of western Iran through much of Iraq, parts of Turkey and Syria, and Lebanon, and then you start getting into Canaan, right, into southern Lebanon, and into Israel, Jordan, Palestine, and then over into Egypt. But Mesopotamia is really this part, so a little bit of Iran, Iraq, Syria, a little bit of Turkey. And this is where we see those first major civilizations and cities. One of the most important of which is the city right down here in the bottom you see called Ur, U-R. We know it from archaeology. In fact, it was a major civilization in the Bronze Age. One of the ways that archaeologists actually define the collapse of the Bronze Age is what they call the Ur-3 period, towards the end of the Bronze Age and its collapse. And so Ur was this major civilization. We're talking around 2000 BC. Okay? It's this major civilization. Now, when we read in Genesis how it refers to the Garden of Eden, it talks about it being a garden in the east. Well, east of where? East of Canaan, right? They're all writing this in Israel. What's east of Canaan that matters? Mesopotamia, right? I should say it wasn't that long after Mesopotamia started to develop. You do see other civilizations and farming start to develop in Egypt, in China, the Yellow River area, in India, in the Indus River Valley, but it really begins in Mesopotamia. So it refers to it being a garden in the east, and it talks about there being 4 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Pishon and the Gihon. Okay? Well, we know the Tigris and the Euphrates. We know what those rivers are. There's some, now this is a little bit conjecture, okay? But some say that there was an ancient river that cut through the Arabian desert that doesn't exist anymore, which was maybe I think the Gihon, they think maybe. Others say it's the Nile. There's the Pishon, which some think is this Karun River that flows into Iran. Some others say it might even be the Danube River. It's not exactly clear, and it doesn't really matter that much, because it's not like we're going to be able to go into, the Persian Gulf region of Iraq and Kuwait and say, oh, this is the garden right here, right? Because we were cast out of the garden, cherubim with a flaming sword put out in front of it. It's not like we can really find it. There's more to say about that I'm not going to get into tonight. The point is, it's very clear that they're using imagery to make us think of Mesopotamia, right? Because they know that's where civilization starts to develop. Okay? Over time, right, Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden. They begin to have children. They have Cain. They have Abel. Cain kills Abel. Abel dies. Cain is cast away again. Like I mentioned a little bit before we were starting to talk, it's interesting to note, we'll come back to this much later, Cain is actually the first one to have sin attributed to him in the Old Testament, in Genesis. But over time, the population of the earth begins to grow, and the wickedness of humankind also grows. People are wicked. And God eventually decides that he's going to send a flood to wipe out all but the righteous Noah and his family and repopulate the earth from there. What we can understand from the descriptions, as well as from the archaeological record and some of the other textual records that we get, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, is it's describing flooding in the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates River in the Persian Gulf. Okay. That's what it's most especially describing. It's not necessarily to say the flood was confined to that geographic region, but that's the imagery that's being used in the writing, in the descriptions. Okay? So we're over here still in Mesopotamia. As time goes on, after Noah, he gets off the boat, him and his children begin to have children of their own. The world begins to be repopulated. And we read a story about how a group of people decide that they are going to build a tower by which they will be able to reach and to control God, maybe even become gods themselves. This tower is described as being in Babel, which we will later come to hear referred to as Babylon. Right? We're still in Mesopotamia. God says, these people are still not getting it, so to speak. He confuses their language and scatters the 70 nations throughout the world. It's at this time, then, that we read about a particular man named Abram, who is in Ur of the Chaldees, it says. Well, what is the name of people, some of the people who still live in Iraq to this day? The Chaldeans. Right? Ur of the Chaldees is referring to the ancient civilization of Ur. Abram is called with his family out of Ur, and he travels north eventually, first to a town called Haran, where his father eventually dies. He takes his nephew Lot, as we talked about last time, and they travel down into the land of Canaan. He then also goes with his wife for a time to Egypt, and then returns back to Canaan, where he and Lot eventually split and establish their respective households, one in the valley of Jordan and one up in the hills. Okay. Are you all with me so far? I know that I'm kind of telling the story in broad strokes rather quickly, but are you understanding a little bit of how this geography is starting to play out, right? The story of the Bible actually, we tend to think of like everything as just being in Israel, right? But we actually miss the point that actually Genesis starts in Mesopotamia, and the story initially gets going there, right? Abraham is called out of Mesopotamia and into the land of Canaan, which God says his descendants will eventually inherit. Okay. We won't talk about all of these other cities, although they're important as time goes on, both culturally, historically, and biblically. But he gets into this area of Canaan, where he eventually establishes himself. Over time, however, we know that, coming back here, Abraham's son, Isaac, right, then has his son Jacob, also known as Israel. Israel has a whole bunch of sons, and the youngest, Joseph, ends up being his favorite because he was born, not only was he the one born in his old age, he says, but he was born of his beloved wife Rachel. Rachel, who was, he had two wives, Leah and Rachel was the one that he especially loved, and so Joseph was special to him. But Joseph's brothers don't like the fact that he was so special to dad, and they eventually sell him into slavery, where he is brought into Egypt and initially is a slave there. I should mention, it's not surprising. There were trade routes, like I said, all through this area. One in particular was known as the King's Highway that went through Canaan and down into Egypt. It is still used to this day. Okay. That King's Highway, that trade route, which is where Joseph gets sold to these traders, is still used as a major trade route through Israel and Palestine and Jordan today. Joseph goes to Egypt, and through a course of several events, he eventually becomes very trusted by the Pharaoh and becomes sort of his executive officer taking over, right? Unfortunately, though, in Canaan, there's a major famine. And eventually, Joseph's brothers come to Egypt looking for food, where over time he reveals himself to his brothers. And they go back to Canaan and bring the entire clan down to Egypt, where they're able to get food because of the famine. Joseph and the Pharaoh take care of them. And it's interesting, he ends up putting them on the outskirts of the Egyptian civilization, in sort of the Sinai Peninsula down here, in particular right in this area. And to this day, archaeologists find all sorts of traces of Semitic encampments on the outskirts of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. It would seem that there were already some Semitic people that were there, sort of on the outskirts of Egypt. And what Pharaoh was saying was, you guys go with your like kind over here on the peninsula. So the Pharaoh sends them out there. Eventually, the Pharaoh, there's a new Pharaoh. It says, quick funny little story in Exodus, it says, came a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, right? I remember hearing about a seminarian one time whose name was Joseph. And he was a rather oddball guy. But for whatever reason, the director of that seminary kind of liked him, took a liking to him. And so he was allowed to stay around despite the fact that he was this very oddball guy. And midway through the semester at one point, there was a change in administration and there was a new seminary director. And this guy comes into the doorway of my friend's room, takes a puff of his cigarette and just says, "Comes a Pharaoh who knows not Joseph." And he was gone by the end of the week. Anyway, so that's what always comes to mind when I read that line in the first chapter of Exodus. In any event, eventually he enslaves the Israelite people, right? He uses them as slave labor in Egypt. And they're suffering under that enslavement, and eventually God says he hears their cries and decides he's going to deliver them. He sends Moses to bring them out. Basically, God keeps turning up the heat on Pharaoh, upends Pharaoh's entire reign and everything going on there with various plagues and all sorts of other things. And finally he says, okay, you can go. And this is a little bit of a reconstruction, but pretty close. Moses leads them out through the Sinai Peninsula down to Mount Sinai, where they receive the law and the covenant. They are formed as a new nation, the nation of Israel. And they sort of make their way up initially and send spies into the promised land, right? God says, I'm going to give you the promised land. They go up there and they spy it out. And the spies come back and most of them say, look, those Canaanite people, they are really big, they are really strong, we are way outnumbered. There's no way that we are going to be able to take this land. Joshua and Caleb being the exceptions. They say, no, God is on our side, we can do it. Well, the people end up believing the spies who doubted and said, no way, we can't do this. And as punishment for their lack of faith in God, they spend the next nearly 40 years traveling in the desert until that entire generation had passed away, so that none of those who doubted God would be able to enter into the promised land themselves, other than, of course, Joshua and Caleb. Moses, they eventually, you can see they're kind of walking in a little bit of a circle, they're around. Eventually they go back up into the plains of Moab. Remember we talked last time about Ruth, who's from Moab. They go to the plains of Moab just across the river from Jericho, where Moses gives his final address to the people of Israel, which we call the book of Deuteronomy. He then dies, and Joshua leads the people into the land of Canaan. And over a period of some time, they're able to eventually take over the land of Canaan. They're led first by Joshua, and then by a series of leaders that were called judges. These judges were not great people. They weren't particularly righteous leaders for the most part. Some were. Gideon was a good example. But for the most part, they weren't very righteous people. And eventually the people start crying out saying, we want a king like the people around us. We want to be an actual kingdom and have some power. And up until then, God had said, no, I'm your king. They said, no, we want a king here. And eventually God relents and appoints for them the king. First Saul, and then David. And under Saul and David, and then later Solomon, David's son, they're able to consolidate the various tribes of Israel into one kingdom here. By the way, where do you get Palestine? It's that the Babylonians initially translated Philistine wrong and called it Palestine. That's where we get that name. And so the Philistia, where the Philistines were, is where we eventually get the name Palestine. But in any event, Saul and David and Solomon consolidate the kingdom. Let me pause again here. I'm going through literally thousands of years of history so far, just to give you sort of this overall view and so that you can see the geography. Questions, comments, thoughts, impressions? Sure.
Yeah, any thoughts on time period from when Adam and Eve existed to the, say, the time of Abraham?
Yeah, so let me get to timeline later. I'm getting to there. Yes, bear with me, and that's a few slides from now, but and we'll address that. I'm trying not to throw dates out yet because I want to focus more on just sort of the flow of the story. Marina?
So all of the land, Aramea and, you know.
Yeah. And the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites.
Were they all pagans? Or did they believe in one God? They just weren't Israelites?
So, yes and no. Okay, so like the Edomites are the descendants of Esau, right? And we know, I don't know that it's exactly on this map. Remember when Moses flees Egypt because he had killed a man, and he's wandering on his own in the desert initially, and he goes, onto the Sinai Peninsula, and he's among the Midianites, and his father-in-law Jethro is described as being a priest of God Most High, right? Well, the Midianites were descendants, I think, of Ishmael, right? So they were Abrahamic people, and they do appear to have maintained some degree of a belief in the Most High God, okay? But that's not entirely the case. So you get up, the Ammonites and the Moabites are not treated very well in the Old Testament. They're not appreciated much. The Arameans especially, what we'll talk about in a minute, from very early on, this northern part of Israel, like in Ashtaroth and some of these other areas, Dan, they're engaging in syncretistic pagan worship very early on, all the time, right? And so, this is where we hear of the worship of Baal. And so, yes, there are certainly pagans. Obviously, the Egyptians were, but some, and the Philistines were for sure. The Amalek, the Amalekites are not viewed favorably in the Old Testament for their demon worship. So it's sort of a mixed bag. There are a few that seem to have had some degree of, at least early on, the worship that Abraham passed down. By the time of David, they're pretty much all engaged in pagan worship. Okay. Earlier on, they still remembered some of what Abraham had passed on to them, but they get away from that pretty quickly. Dora?
When you talked about Abraham's journey, did he actually go to Mecca?
There's no reason to think that.
Okay.
In fact, I'd have to look back a little bit more at the history of it, but I suspect it was not really much of a city at the time. But there's certainly nothing in the Old Testament to suggest that. And there's no reason for him to have done it, given that the trade route comes way up here. He's said very clearly to have been in Haran. That's way up north, right? Mecca's way down here in the Arabian Peninsula. And there were no trade routes really that went there. Not any of the established trade routes. So there's no reason to think that would have happened. Yeah.
Was what we were just looking at the map, is this what the borders that were given to Israel by God?
More or less, yeah.
And
yeah.
Palestine was part of that also, right?
Significant portions of it, yes. Yeah, I mean, you see, for example, Gaza is still part of Philistia, even in this time. But major portions of what we would call Palestine for sure.
I'm always confused. Sinai Peninsula, which country is that?
Egypt.
Oh,
That's
Egypt.
Egypt. Yeah. So yeah, down this here. Now, I don't know the exact modern borders, but it's somewhere around in here. Remember when it was in the 60s, Egypt and Israel were fighting wars, right? It's because they share a border down here. But the Sinai Peninsula is part of Egypt. And maybe when we get to it, Themis actually had the opportunity to visit St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. And the burning bush is still there. It's still alive. It's still growing. And so when we get to that point, we'll have Themis talk a little bit about that as well. In fact, they still have like the area where the golden calf was built. All of those areas are still marked out and understood. So anyway, you have the kingdom here set up. What we often, I think, kind of doesn't connect for us is the fact that actually the kingdom of Israel was only united for a very short period of time, relatively. You have Saul, you have David, you have Solomon. Solomon's sons get in and they immediately start a civil war. Okay. And you very quickly have Israel broken into now two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, which is this area of Israel, with its main capital in Samaria. Fast forward, why do the Israelites not like Samaritans? Right? Or the Judeans, rather, not like Samaritans in the New Testament? This is history going back centuries, right? And they set up false worship centers, shrines in Dan and in Bethel, where the syncretistic pagan worship, they start to bring in Baal worship into Israel almost right away. Okay, set up golden calves in Bethel for worship, and they're engaged in the syncretistic worship very quickly. Meanwhile, the southern tribes, which is really Judah and I think Benjamin, are in the kingdom of Judah, with their capital and their main site of worship being in Jerusalem. Doesn't take long, like I said, for Israel, the northern kingdom especially, to fall into pagan worship and to abandon God. God warns them through a series of prophets to knock it off, right? You're going to essentially reap what you're sowing. I have to do something to wake you up and bring your attention back if you don't do it on your own. And sure enough, they refuse. And not that long later, eventually, the Assyrians come in, and this is in somewhere around the 8th century BC. The Assyrians come in, and they take over and capture all of those northern tribes of Israel. So when we talk about the 10 lost tribes of Israel you hear about, that's what they're talking about. This northern kingdom with the other 10 tribes get taken over by the Assyrians, taken to places like Haran and Nineveh, and even as far away as into what we would say is modern-day Iran, never to be heard from again. They're absorbed into the population. Pagans, for the most part, are brought back into that area of Canaan, who eventually develop a certain kind of syncretistic religion, which is the Samaritan religion. Okay? And those 10 tribes, those 10 northern tribes, are never really heard from again in history. Okay? They're dissipated. Well, the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, wasn't that far behind in terms of their abandoning God. Right? Even the kings of Judah, you have a couple of bright spots, but for the most part, they're not following God either. They aren't following the law. They're ignoring him and engaging in all sorts of syncretistic worship themselves. And so God allows the same fate. Again, he has multiple prophets who come in and say, knock it off, stop, come back. come back to me, and they keep ignoring me. And eventually, he allows the Babylonians, or the Neo-Babylonian Empire, to come in and take them over as well. They're exiled into Babylon. Okay, this is where we read about, for example, Esther in the Old Testament. It's where we read about Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar and the three youths in the furnace. Right, all of this is going on with Babylon. But and they destroy the temple. They raze it. The temple's no more. Solomon's temple is gone. But eventually, through their repentance and prayers, after the Edict of Cyrus, which we know about not only from the Bible, but from other sources in the historical record, in about 539 BC, he returns a fraction. Basically what he does is he says to the Jews, if you want to go back, you can. And a fraction of those people who had been exiled to Babylon do take him up on that offer and come back. Some stay. And there was actually a pretty thriving Jewish culture in Babylon until pretty late. Even I think at the time of Christ, there was still a pretty well established Jewish diaspora in Babylon. But they eventually come back, and this is where we read about Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament, where they come back and they rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This is, you'll hear sometimes referred to as the Second Temple period. And that's that period where the new temple is built after the return from Babylon until shortly after the time of Christ in AD 70, when was it Vespasian, the Roman emperor who destroys the temple, destroys Jerusalem for good to this day. But so essentially, right, Israel's always being exiled either into Egypt or back into Mesopotamia and then coming back, right? It's these three locations. That's what I'm trying to get across, is that it's, in Mesopotamia, to Canaan, to Egypt, back to Canaan, back to Egypt, back to Canaan, to Mesopotamia, back to Canaan, right? It's this whole flow between these three locations. Just to...
I know that's on your tape on something.
Oh, don't worry about it. Just to flesh out a little bit in terms of the location, eventually you have Alexander the Great and the Seleucid Empire, which eventually takes over all of Mesopotamia and Canaan, and through other successors, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Alexandria and Memphis and so on in Egypt. Canaan, though, is ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty after the Maccabean revolt. So the Jewish Maccabees, you read, there's 3 books of Maccabees in the Old Testament. They throw off the Greek rule, the Seleucid rule, and establish the Hasmonean dynasty, which ends with the Herodian dynasty that we read about in the New Testament. Herod the Great was the immediate successor to the Hasmoneans and actually married a Hasmonean princess to try and give himself some legitimacy as being some sort of an heir of the Maccabeans. With Herod, though, in order to get power, he agreed to be a Roman client state. So that's when Israel, Canaan, becomes part of the Roman Empire. And that's where we pick up the story of the New Testament. I'm going to go to timeline in a minute, but does this make sense in terms of geography? Do you see the flow, even if you don't remember all of the details of what I've just said? I've now taken you essentially from Eden to the New Testament, and what you see is this flow constantly between Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt, and back. Yeah.
The beginning of humanity is in this area, as you described it. There are people that say that humanity began in the Rift Valley of Africa. Any sense to that?
I don't. I mean, in the sense that, and we'll talk more as we get into it. First of all, we'll come to this in a few more sessions, but remember that Genesis is not written as a history book or a science book. right? There is no sense in the ancient world of history in the way that we understand it, or even that the ancient Romans would have understood it, and the Greeks under Herodotus and Plutarch and so on. Similarly, their notions of science are not the same as like a biology textbook that you go buy in a college bookstore today. I am not suggesting in any way that what the Bible says is true and that it didn't happen. But you have to understand what the Bible is teaching and the genre in which it's written and how it's trying to convey those truths to us. Which is why I don't think that there is ever any conflict between science and the Bible. In terms of, what, I don't know what science will eventually be able to show. I mean, there were scientists 200 years ago who tried to argue that essentially the first people were all white Europeans. So, and they had endowed chairs at fancy universities. We know that that's not true. That clearly isn't true. But maybe, that's all I would say. But stay tuned, I guess is what I'm saying. We'll come more to Eden and Genesis in a few sessions. Anything more on sort of the flow of geography, Carol?
Just if you have any idea, the green, how many miles is that? Like thousands or?
Certainly several hundred. I don't know exactly the measure, but I mean, this is, here you're talking about, right, this is Byzance. By the way, this is, unfortunately, it's a German map, so the names don't look entirely right. Mittelmeer is Mediterranean. Byzance, right? What is this? This is Constantinople, right here. Byzantium, right?
That's the
So,
Black Sea.
I'm sorry?
Black Sea.
I mean, you've got your
Right,
Turkey to
right.
Iran further.
Exactly.
So, I mean,
This is very far,
that's.
right? This is a long way. So this is Iran and some of the stands over here, right?
Okay.
All the way to Turkey and Greece. I think this is Athens right here, right? You got Cyprus and Crete. So this is a big area,
Okay.
right? Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Yeah.
That when you say syncretistic, can you explain that before?
They're blending the Hebrew religion with the pagan religions of the people around them, right? So keeping the temple, but setting up idols inside the temple to other gods as well, right? Hedging their bets, so to speak. Adopting the pagan practices of the people around them while maintaining some degree. I mean, look, it's so bad that by the time you get to Josiah's reform, they go searching for the Torah, the law, and he rereads it, but they couldn't put their hands on the law at all, right? He has to go searching for it. So they've gone that far. Is it his father was Manasseh, who was a terrible pagan, who repents at some point, and his great prayer of repentance is what we read in Great Compline every Lent, prayer of Manasseh. There's a reason why in the icon of the resurrection, when it shows the righteous in Hades, only 2 kings of Israel are ever shown, David and Josiah. Right? They're really the only 2 righteous kings of Israel, or Judah. For the most part, the rest of them were not so righteous. Hezekiah and Manasseh had their good time periods in their life, but that was about it. Right? Even Solomon, when we read about him, right? We usually read the first part. He's the son of David and Bathsheba, and he asks for wisdom, and God gives him wisdom, and he writes this great wisdom literature, and so on. But then actually, if you go further into 3rd Kingdoms or 1st Kings, right, he ends up taking hundreds of wives and concubines from pagan lands, who all basically get him to go along, right? Wives have an amazing power over their husbands when it comes to going to church, right? And essentially they get him to start engaging in all sorts of pagan practices as well. You know, he's not one of those righteous kings in the end. So does this all make sense in terms of, yeah?
So it was first the Greek, Alexander's empire, and then the Romans captured the Canaan Peninsula? How did
Yes. So Alexander's empire was actually much bigger than this, right?
Yeah.
His initial empire stretches from essentially India all the way to you know, Western Europe. It gets broken up, right, to a few different successors, and the green, what this is showing is really the Seleucid Empire, which was one part of Alexander's empire, taken over by one of his successors. So like Egypt, like I said, was the Ptolemaic Greeks who overtook that. Eventually, you're right, over time the Roman Empire begins to expand and take over basically Alexander's old land, as well as additional lands, like they push into Great Britain and elsewhere. And all of this area, for the most part, becomes Roman Empire. You know, Rome and Persia will continue to fight well into what we later, you know, the later life of the Roman Empire, what people today might call the Byzantine Empire, right? They're fighting with Persia. When we celebrate the exaltation of the cross, it's because the Persians stole the cross from Jerusalem and we had to take it back. Basically, they're fighting, Rome is fighting with Persia right up until Persia is taken over by the Muslim Arabs, and then we're just fighting with them, right? But anyway, this portion though, right, modern day Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, you know, Palestine, and into you know, northern Africa will all become Roman territory eventually, by the time of Christ. Yeah. Okay, and yeah.
Out of reference, where exactly is Jordan?
It's here. You know what? Oops. Rather than guessing, so Jordan is this part right here. Okay. Israel's the little sliver. Israel and Palestine is this little sliver right above the Sinai Peninsula, and then Jordan extends over here beneath Syria and Iraq, along the border of Arabia. All right.
I have one question, but kind of off the topic of the maps, but you said something about Cain being the first sinner.
So he
Is
says,
that possible if there wasn't any laws prescribed as yet?
so, yes, but it's because you have to understand what it's calling, what is sin, and what it's being used. And so what I will, let me find it. He says, this is in Genesis 4, chapter 7. He said, God says to Cain, if you are doing right, surely you ought to hold your head high. But if you are not doing right, sin is crouching at the door, hungry to get you. You can still master him. When we get there, we'll talk a little bit about what he's referring to there. But there's an understanding there of sin not exactly being an ethical transgression, something more than that. The language it's using is essentially referring to essentially a kind of demon that comes out of the ground. Because as we'll talk about much later when we get to the theme of theosis, the Old Testament also understands the process of demonosis. That following God's commandments and doing good is a participation in God that results in us becoming more like Him. Doing those things that God tells us we should not do is actually a participation in the demon's rebellion and makes us like them. and there is no neutral ground. And that theme gets picked up in the New Testament. Okay? So it's not
There's no
so much.
political correctness.
Yeah, it's not right. It's not an ethical translation or transgression. We are either participating in being formed in the image of and coming closer to God, or we are participating in being formed in the image of and becoming one with the demonic powers. And there's no neutral ground.
You're either in or you're out.
Yeah, and I think that when you start to think in that way, it changes how we look at our lives and what we're doing, right? It's not about the do's and the don'ts. It's the be like me or be like them, right? And this is the whole dynamic of being made in the image and likeness of God that comes out from Genesis. And it's a theme that continues all the way in through the New Testament. And if you read our liturgical text today, that theme is still there. When you read books like the Philokalia and the other fathers of the church, that theme remains strong. And it's in all of our liturgical texts, especially the weekday texts that we read in Matins and Vespers, primarily in monasteries, but also in a lot of parishes. You know, in Greece, most of the main churches all still have Orthros and Vespers every day, right? And when you actually read and listen to those texts, what you see is this very theme. And we'll come back to that when we get to Abraham. So let me talk a little bit about timeline. Again, so I'm taking this from Professor Richter, who I mentioned before. You don't need to have this memorized, but it's just to give you a little bit of an overall context. You'll notice Eden and Noah have question marks, okay? Because there is, so I had you read the genealogies, right, from Matthew and Luke last time, that do begin with Adam and go all the way down. What you have to understand, though, is that Old Testament genealogies are not meant to be exhaustive. Okay, their genealogies are bookmarks or file folders, right, of the major figures in that genealogy. But there are other people in between. Okay, which is why, for example, Matthew and Luke can have different genealogies. Right? They're not trying to trace out. This isn't Ancestry.com. Okay, they're telling you the major figures in that descent. And so we'll talk more later why there are question marks next to Eden and Noah, but for now I'm not going to give you any kind of specific date and say it was them. Okay? I'm not suggesting that it didn't happen. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this exile or leaving Ur, is around 2000 BC, which is right around the time that Ur 3 period is starting to collapse. There's a lot of people moving out of that area. It's not surprising that people would leave. The question is that this individual leaves and where he leaves from and where he goes in response to God's call. A few generations later, they go down into Egypt with Joseph and the tribes, somewhere around between 1850 and 1700 BC. Which is a little bit before the major pyramids are built, but they're there. They probably were helping build those very pyramids. Right? The Israelites leave Egypt somewhere in that period of around 1445 to as late as 1275. You know, these are a little bit bracketed dates because it's not entirely clear from the archaeological record. They wandered the desert for 40 years. There's Joshua and the conquest with the era of the judges, which extends for a few hundred years as they're slowly conquering Canaan and establishing the various tribal allotments within that area. You have Saul, David, and Solomon, which is happening right around that 1050-ish AD. By the way, some people used to hold until not very long ago that David didn't actually exist, that he was just sort of this mythological figure within Jewish tradition. So now all of a sudden they found a bunch of non-Jewish, non-Israelite inscriptions of the people around them, archaeologically, with references to David. And so, now all of a sudden, this is what I mean when I say, we have to, it's always a work in progress a little bit with what we understand, because all of a sudden the science and history start saying, oh, well, maybe what we thought was mythical wasn't. Anyway, they last for not that long. There's divided monarchy, and you start to have these dual tracks of Israel and Judah. Israel, it's not that long, and you get to Ahab and Jezebel and Elijah, and all of them saying, don't do it, right? Bad news. And eventually, at around 722, Assyria destroys them. You have the kingdom of Judah, which continues on. And you see here listed are the various prophets that were prophesying in those regions during those times. Okay? Remember Hosea, who we talked about last time, I was saying was referring to the northern tribes, right? The northern kingdom and its harlotry. So somewhere around 587, 586, you have the Babylonian exile. They're in Babylon for 70 years. Edict of Cyrus. They come back. There's the rebuilding of the temple. You have Ezra and Nehemiah who participate in helping to rebuild. You have some of these latter prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. You have Alexander and the Hasmoneans who overthrew with the Maccabees. That's your overview. Don't have to memorize this. My only point is to just sort of give you this overview of kind of this unfolding, right? Now we're going to go back and start to dive in more detail for how all of this history develops. Right? Yeah.
Is Elijah the most important prophet to the Jewish people?
In some respects. I mean, there was an understanding that Elijah would herald the coming of the Messiah. Okay, but and what you see, this goes into a much longer topic, but what you see is that John the Baptist fulfills that ministry, right? Christ points to him as being Elijah. He is the prophet of God, right? And by the way, I follow. So you asked an interesting question. Why didn't John follow Christ? You sent me an email on this. You said, why didn't John follow Christ? Well, one, because he had a ministry appointed to him that was prophesied that he would be the Elijah. And as he said, he would have to ultimately decrease and Christ would increase. By the time that John is sending his disciples to Christ to say, are you in fact the Messiah that we should be following? John's already in prison. Right? He can't leave prison to follow Christ anymore. So when Christ finally affirms to John's disciples, yes, in fact, indeed, I am the Messiah, which John understood, but he had to make the way straight, right? And he sends his disciples then to Christ, and at that point, he's already in prison and ends up being killed for speaking the truth to Herod. But we see in John the Baptist fulfilling this prophecy that they pointed to Elijah, right? Interesting note, on the cross, Christ calls out, right, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And the Jews mishear him and say, oh, he's calling to Elias, Eliah, right? They say, he's calling to Elias. Step back for a minute. Why would they think that a Jewish person would be calling to someone dead if there wasn't already a practice of praying to the saints? Why would he be calling to Elijah if that was something so abhorrent to the Jewish faith? Right? Because it's not like they comment and say, in horror, right? Like, what is he doing? He's blaspheming by doing this. They just sort of say, he's calling to Elijah. because that wasn't so completely foreign to them in their practice even at that time. They understood that the righteous were alive and still had a role to play, in a sense. All right. Any other questions about the timeline? I've gone a little bit over than I normally would, but I wanted to give sort of, again, don't have to memorize all of this. I'm giving a little bit of an overview, and next time we're going to jump into what is a covenant, both in terms of the Near Eastern culture and in terms of some of the examples in the Old Testament. What is a covenant? Because we use that word all the time, right? In fact, we talk about the Bible being the Old and New Testament. What's testament mean? Covenant, right? Just a different, older English word for the same thing. Old covenant and new covenant. We use these words all the time, the covenant with Israel, the covenant with David. What does all that mean? So we'll go back to the cultural context of that and then look more at some examples from the scripture. If you want to read ahead for what will be, who are the major covenantal figures, right? That gives us that context. It is Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Christ. Sound familiar? Okay, that's why I say that those are the people that are going to be our structure or our bookmarks, because they're the major covenantal figures. But before we can talk about their covenants, we have to talk about what is a covenant. And so that'll be next time. If you want to get ahead, you can read Joshua chapters 9 and 10, Genesis chapter 15, and Exodus chapters 19 and 20. Those will help give a little bit of context when we start to talk about what is a covenant. Give you some. We'll look at some of the features of what's going on there. I'll let you take the pictures. Any other questions before we wrap up? You know, we've got another fascinating talk coming up just in a moment. Any other questions? All right. With that, see Father Nico come in. Father, you want to offer the closing prayer?
Sure. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Father.
Glory to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, will now and ever unto the ages of ages. Amen. Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy. Lord, Father, give the blessing.
We thank you, Lord our God, for all the blessings that you have given us, for the light of understanding of your gospel, your scriptures. May you always guide us by your Holy Spirit to see the wisdom which you have given us for the betterment of our own lives and for the whole world, through your Lord, now to the ages of ages. Amen.
Amen.
Sit down, everybody, for the next talk.
Yeah.